Hey everyone, it's Niharo here, and today I've got a 1-bar Necromancer build guide for you. As always, everything's timestamped below, so feel free to skip ahead. Of course, I am going to do a little intro here and talk a little bit about the build before we get into the skills. So why play a Necromancer and why play a 1-bar build? So I'll start with the latter first. So the reason you might want to play a 1-bar build, besides the fact that it's just going to be simpler than a normal build, is because it's a really good place to start, especially when you're very new to the game, or if you're just someone who doesn't have a ton of experience with MMOs and you want to start someplace a little bit more simpler. And as usual, with all of my 1-bar build guides, I'm going to try to make sure that this build will work in group content and that you're not going to be leaving out any quintessential skill that your class brings that the group would, generally speaking, be expecting you to have. What I mean by this is if you go in and you parse, which means like do damage to a trial dummy, which is the big Iron Atro, there's a couple of different versions, but it's the 21 million health dummy. It gives you all these buffs, and it will effectively double your damage, actually a little bit more than double your damage compared to not having buffs. And it depends on what class you're on, what your setup was, etc., but that's just like a rough number. So you can go from doing 50,000 to doing over 100,000 damage by going from the smaller skeleton to the Iron Atro, to the 21 million health dummy. So again, basically the whole idea here is that, you know, all the unique class buffs, all the unique sets, and damage increasing sets you could have in a given group, not all of them, but a fair number, that's what the buffs that the trial dummy will give, because that's what you'll conceivably have in an optimized group. So we want to make sure that we don't make a 1-bar build, and this is fairly common, but we want to make sure we don't make a 1-bar build that we say is for all content that doesn't bring those kind of buffs and group utility that everybody's going to be expecting you to have. And we don't really need to compromise just because it's a 1-bar build. So again, it's going to be easy, and we're still going to make sure we're bringing all those buffs that we can or would generally be expected to bring to our group. So now let's move on to the next question, which is why play a Necromancer? And I think the main reason for that is just the flavor. They're just a really fun class to play. I have had a lot of questions recently about like which class should someone play, and they're thinking about one versus the other. I just want to say that all classes are equally viable in all content in ESO. And I think that's ubiquitous. You know, you could argue that at the very high end, certain classes are better, some patches are another. But if you ever reach that level, which most people will not, you're going to have one of everything long before you get to that point anyways. And so it's not really going to matter for you. So all classes can do all things. They can all be very survivable. They can all solo content. They can all do great in group content. They can all tank. They can all heal, etc., etc. A few are a little bit worse at some of those things than others. But generally speaking, tanks are much more the issue than DPS or healers. DPS and healers can, again, really be any class and be just fine. So as a Necromancer, one of the main things that you can bring to a group that really a couple other classes can, but typically don't because it's just so easy for a Necromancer to do, and that is the buff from Elemental Catalyst. This is a 5-piece set that drops from Stone Garden, and what it does is it increases the critical damage taken by opponents by 15% in total. So for each type of damage that you do to an opponent, electricity, ice, or fire, it puts the debuff on them and increases their damage taken by 5%. This is a pretty significant buff. This is one of those buffs that is given by the Iron Atro, by the 21 million health dummy. And so it is one that certainly you would expect to have in any kind of optimized group, and it is a set that you can wear on this build. It's not going to be quite as good as it could be on a 2-bar build, but it's still going to work very well, so it is an option for you. And the goal with these builds is that you would be able to start here, and then if you're someone who's capable, and by capable I mean physically capable, you don't have any limitations or anything like that, and interested in moving to a more complex build, that you can then switch over and do a 2-bar build. If you're looking for that, I do have a 2-bar build that is optimized for group content, and also has some solo options. It talks about EC, much longer video that I've also done on the channel, and also go a little bit more in depth, because again, this build is designed more for beginners, those who are new, people who want something a little bit more simple, and that one is designed still for people who are new and are maybe learning, but it's intended to be more complete. All right, I think that's enough preamble. Let's go ahead and get into it and talk about skills here. As a quick note here, this card and other cards like this can be found here on YouTube on the community tab. You can download those. You can also come by the That Wasn't the Boss Discord server. We have them there. They're there for you to download, share with whoever you'd like, and just be a reference guide for you. And I'm sorry if I sound a little bit weird. I'm kind of sick right now, but I'm just trying to get some work done here. Get a video out to you guys, not leave you hanging for too long. All right, so first up here is a Nerving Boneyard. So this skill is going to be one of our sources of frost damage on this build, and it is also going to apply Major Breach, which is going to reduce an enemy's resistances by just under 6,000. That's about a 9% DPS increase if they're not already at 0 resistances from debuffs and everything like that. So this is a really important skill just to have for any kind of group or solo content, because again, you're causing opponents to take 9% more damage, and that's in addition to the damage it does, which is significant. So it's a really nice ability. It does a decent amount of damage. It will also consume a corpse if there is one on the ground in the area, and that'll cause it to do 30% more damage, which is awesome and something we'll pretty much always have up. We don't really need to worry about it too much because we're going to be using our blast bones, which we'll get to in a second, all the time. And so generally you don't have to worry about it. If there's corpses on the ground for other things you've killed, that also works as well. So really great ability. It's an AoE, applies Major Breach, does frost damage, which was one of the damage types we need for our Elemental Catalyst set. And it looks cool to boot. So that's pretty awesome. It looks cool as well. And the next skill up here is our Detonating Siphon. And this ability we want for a couple of reasons, which is going to be a theme with all of these abilities on this bar. So while just slotted, while just being on our bar, the passive from this skill gives us increased 3% damage. So that's awesome. That's why we want it on our bar. And if we were doing a 2-bar build, why we want to make sure to have it on our front bar, because that's where we're going to be most of the time. So that's really nice. And then this is another ability that uses our corpse. So Necros kind of have this corpse management thing you have to do. So we can always be creating one with our blast bones, which we will be. So if this is ever grayed out, it's because there's no corpse around. If you just wait for your blast bones to go off, you'll be able to use this again. If you recast this early because you have a corpse on the ground as well, you should also know that it explodes and does AoE damage. So depending on what kind of spammable you're using, if you have a bunch of corpses on the ground and you're using more or less a single target spammable, you can use Detonating Siphon to recast it early to get a bit of AoE damage going, and it actually works quite well. Now, if we're running Elemental Catalyst, we need some form of electricity damage. And to do that, we would actually remorph this to our Mystic Siphon, which is down below here. And the only difference between that and the other abilities, it doesn't explode, so it doesn't do that extra damage. It does give us a little bit of health, mag, and stam recovery while we're using it. But again, the main reason we want to use this for the shock damage if we're running Elemental Catalyst. That's one of the sacrifices you get for running that set, is you have to do a little bit less damage via remorphing this skill. So in general, or unless you just really like the RP of the Mystic Siphon, go with Detonating Siphon. It'll do a little bit more damage. And then for our spammables. So this is actually a place where you have quite a few options for our spammables. And with the next patch, update 37, which is coming out shortly, which is what this build is designed for, we're going to have even more. So for maximum DPS, what you want to use here is a morph of Silver Bolts, which is from the Fighters Guild skill line, and you want to use the morph Silver Shards. This is a stamina spammable, and it does a little bit of cleave damage to other targets nearby, which is really nice. This does the most damage because it is a hard-hitting spammable, and it also gives us extra damage via the Fighters Guild passives. Now, if you want to use something else because you want to use a Necromancer skill, or for whatever reason you don't like the animation, you just don't like the skill, whatever reason, you could use Venom Skull, and you're really not going to get much of a DPS loss. It's fairly minor. For me, it was kind of within the margin of error, so I would imagine it's probably a couple of thousand damage. That's the only difference. Not too bad at all. So Venom Skull would work just fine. If you instead wanted to go with a Magicka morph, and because you wanted to go with more with a Magicka Necromancer build, you could also go with the Magicka morph of the Skull. That would work just fine. It does a little bit less single target damage, but it does AoE damage, so it'll ricochet to multiple targets. The other benefit of that is it does flame damage as well, so if you're running EC, that would make sure that your Elemental Catalyst is continually procced with fire damage. We can get that from our next ability, the Blast Bones, which also does fire damage, but it only procs for 3 seconds, and so if you're not really good at casting Blast Bones every 3 seconds, you'll have a little bit of downtime, just a fraction of a second, probably maybe 1 second, where you'll have downtime, and so using Ricochet Skull could make sure that you get full uptime with that. Also, if you wanted to now, two-handers are now a thing. They're going to be a thing in update 37, and you wanted to use that, you could also use Wrecking Blow. and that could be another stamina spammable. If you wanted to go with something else, there are other options. You could go basically any spammable that is good, you could put here. Okay, I just couldn't list every single one of them, so I wanted to give you a handful. If you want to make sure you use, just necromancer abilities, the skull is a great way to go, either venom or ricocheting skull. If you want to use force pulse, which is from the destro staff skill line, you would need to make sure you have an inferno staff, but you could use that. That'll also help your EC up times because it does all 3 damage types every time you use it as a spammable, which you'll be doing constantly. So that's another great way to have really good EC up times, and it does a bit of cleave damage. But again, I've shown you here what I think does the most damage and what works really well. But again, we're talking very small margins as far as which one does more. Weaving with the new Wrecking Blow, I find to be less than enjoyable just because it's kind of a channeled attack, and I really don't like those. But that's just my take. You could also use from the dual weapon skill line Rapid Strikes, which is another channeled attack with daggers if you want to do that. So again, you've got a ton of options. Whatever you want for your spammable, you can put it here. And then I want to talk about one more. I know there's just a million spammables here, but one more spammable that could be very interesting for you and something you definitely want to use in trash in any kind of optimized group, and that is Ruinous Scythe. So you would just swap this out as your spammable, and it does AoE damage in front of you and a cone in front of you, and also heals you for a %. So if you're in a lot of trash, or if you just need an extra heal, this can be one that will heal you by doing damage. So Ruinous Scythe. The additional effect is this: it'll also set enemies off balance, which, we're using the Explorer passive, again, in trash and any kind of group content. Most of the other people in the group will be using Exploiter, and so you can provide that off balance for them. So very important in group content that you use this Ruinous Scythe and just replace your spammable with it, and it works amazing. It is only melee, so just keep that in mind. That is kind of a disadvantage for it, so you do have to be in melee to heal. If you were on a mag build, you can totally use Hungering Scythe. It does not provide the off balance, but it does provide you with a heal over time, and otherwise it functions largely the same. So another option for a spammable there. And then next up, we have Stalking Blast Bones. So this is, most of these morphs of these skills, you can kind of use either one situationally. For this one, I would really recommend that you stick with the Magicka morph of this skill, just because it'll do a little bit more damage, and the other one doesn't really give you any benefit. It just reduces the target's healing, which is more of a PvP thing, if anything. It'll also give you the fire damage if you're running EC. You do want to be casting Blast Bones is going to be your highest DPSing abilities, and you want to make sure you're casting it every 3rd skill. So that means you'll see in the rotation section later, but you'll cast 1 skill, a 2nd skill, and then Blast Bones. 1, 2, Blast Bones. 1, 2, Blast Bones. And that is actually one of the most important things for getting your rotation down on a Necromancer, is making sure you hit this ability every 3rd skill. And it does AoE damage, does a bunch of damage, and it also creates a corpse, which we're gonna need for our other skills. So it'll buff our Boneyard, and it'll allow us to cast our Siphon, which otherwise doesn't have any cost at all. And then moving on to our 3rd skill here, we're gonna use from the Fighter's Guild skill line, this is Barb Trap. This gives us minor force, and that's why we want to use it on our bar, and it also does a decent amount of damage. Now, it does take a 1.5 to arm, so this is kind of a weird skill where you want to actually recast this a couple seconds before the duration expires to make sure you have that major force up time 100%. Now, if you do need to swap out an ability, this is the one I'm going to recommend to swap out. And the reason for that, it's single target. We will be losing 10% of our critical damage, which is significant, but it's also hard to justify dropping one of the other skills. And so that's why I'm saying, hey, here would be our flex spot. Again, it's a little bit hard on 1-bar builds because you have so few spots here, so few skills you can slot. I mean, I know it feels like a lot to a newer person, but after you played for a while, you're like, I need more skills, I need more space. I've even had people who've watched my various videos say, hey, this 1-bar build is cool, but I really like the 2-bar version. I've got more flex spots, I can change things up and not really lose any DPS, and it feels a lot better. So that's why another one of those reasons you might want to eventually move to a 2-bar build. But here's the spot. It works just well. You could slot in a heal here. I've got a couple of heals mentioned. So, and this is a little bit of a problem with the Necromancer, is they have kind of 3 or 4 different heals that you could use in different situations. They're all very good, but they're just kind of different. They work, they function a little bit differently. And yeah, so let's just talk about it. So the first up here is Resistant Flesh. Now, whenever you cast this ability, it's going to pretty much heal you from almost 0 to full. Okay, so, and if it crits, definitely will heal you your entire health. So this is a really expensive heal. You're not going to be able to cast a whole lot, but it will heal you to full health, and you can also cast it on others. So if you need to help somebody else out. The next heal that we're going to talk about is our Spirit Mender. And there are two morphs of this. There's our Spirit Guardian. Spirit Guardian lasts a little bit longer, twice as long actually, but heals for half as much per 2 seconds. However, it also reduces our damage taken by 10% while we have it up. So just by having this up, it'll constantly be giving us a little bit of passive healing and reduces our damage taken by 10%. If you choose the Intensive Mender, it'll last half as long, only 8 seconds, but it'll heal for twice as much. And I'm gonna explain why you might pick one of these over the other, but let me go ahead and talk about the third one here, which is Braided Tether. So Braided Tether consumes a corpse. You do need a corpse to cast it, but it lasts for a fair amount of time. It lasts for 12 seconds, and it will heal you and anybody who the tether passes through, as well as increasing your just general healing by 3%. Okay, so now which heal to use? So the idea here is that if you're taking big hits, you probably need to use something like Resistant Flesh to top you off. If you can stay alive with using a lesser heal, then you want to go with like the Mender, either Intensive for bigger heals, or if you're taking less damage, go with our Spirit Guardian, and that'll heal you for less, but it lasts for twice as long, so you don't have to cast it as often. And then if you are still taking less damage, then you could use something like Braided Tether, which doesn't cost any Magicka. It lasts for a decent amount of time and heals those around you while it's active. So kind of the idea here is like use Resistant Flesh. If you're taking big hits, you need a bunch of healing. And then if you don't need quite as much healing, I think most of the time you'll use one of the Menders. Again, there's something to recommend both of them. They're both fine. I would just say try it out. If it's enough that it's keeping you from dying, then that's the heal to go with. Otherwise, go up to Resistant Flesh. And then if you don't need that, you can move down to something like Braided Tether or Mortal Coil. And this is one of those things that I've talked about before, but this is the difference in the classes, you know? Someone like, oh, this class is great, this other class is better, whatever. They all can do everything. It's just the way they do it is different. And when you move from one to the other, sometimes it can feel like, oh, this sucks. But a lot of times it's just getting used to it and saying, okay, is this a play style that I enjoy and that I like? Now, moving on to ultimates here. So sticking with the idea of having fighter skilled skill abilities on our bar does give us passive increase to our weapon and spell damage, and turns out actually does the most damage, and that is Flawless Dawnbreaker. So this ultimate does a kind of a smaller AoE, does physical damage, and increases our weapon and spell damage by 300 for 20 seconds after casting it, and we just use this whenever we can off of cooldown. Now, if you're in a group setting and you need a Colossus, or if you want to just use all Necro skills, you could instead go with our Colossus. I'm recommending the Stamina Morph of this because it does a little bit more damage. I will note the Frozen Colossus, which is the Magicka Morph, will stun enemies on the last bash. You'll see this big guy come up, big Chungus dude, smashes the ground 3 times, and then the third time on the Magicka Morph, it will stun your opponents. The Stamina Morph, it does extra damage each time it smashes the ground, and it also applies Major Vulnerability, which increases the damage our enemies take by 10%. And if you're in group content and you need this Major Vulnerability because you don't have it from other sources, you should absolutely be willing and able to run the Glacial Colossus. I would note if you run this instead of Dawnbreaker, again, we're talking of a fairly small DPS change, like 1 or 2%. So don't be afraid to run this if you just really like it, think it's cool, whatever reason. It's a little bit easier because the Dawnbreaker you kind of cast right where your character's at, and this ability you can kind of throw, and having the stun can be nice for solo content if you're trying to kite opponents and do other kind of stuff. Now, I know that's it for this card. I do want to talk about one other skill, and that's because I know that a lot of people really like the Necro theme. You know, you like playing a class for the particular theme. So if you wanted to do something else instead of our Barb Trap here and you want a DPS ability, either one of your skeletons, either your Skeletal Archer or Skeletal Arcanist, those are both morphs of the Skeletal Mage, you could use either one of them. The Skeletal Archer will do a little bit more single target damage. The Skeletal Arcanist does AoE damage. So that is something you could slot in there if you wanted to go all Necro skills. You could go with the Venom Skull or either more for the Skull. You go with one of the skeletons for this 5 spot, and then you could go with your Colossus for your ultimate. And again, honestly, I was parsing like 90k with that setup, so it's 2k difference or very, very little difference. And so if you want to do that, I don't think you're going to be missing out on too much. So that is just another option for you. The other thing about using the skeleton is it will give you another corpse that you can use. All right, now let's go ahead and move on to our gear options here. So we'll start off with crafted gear. And what you'll want to do with this build is wear 6 pieces of medium armor and 1 piece of light, just give you a little bit extra penetration, and that is for group content. If you are going to be running a lot of solo content, or you're just going to be running this in solo, going all light is just fine. It'll increase your penetration, and that will help you do more damage in solo content. It'll also help you a bit with your Magicka recovery. You want to really lean into the hybrid meta as much as you can and use skills of different types, because you have so many skills that use corpses and not actually use mana, Magicka, or stamina. They are really easy to sustain. On this build, I'm using just max stat food with no recovery. So if you're running around solo, though, you would just swap that out and use something with more recovery. Someone told me recently, there's another YouTuber, maybe it was an old video, but they were saying that, Necros, like you sacrifice a lot, or you have, for sustain, and it's a problem. That is not true in my experience. Hopefully that was an old post or something, because that has not been my experience with a necromancer, at least not as of late. So for your 2 5-piece sets, if you're going crafted, I would go with Order's Wrath. That is going to be the best crafted set you can get right now for a typical build. And then for your second set, you can really do anything. Julianos is a great crafted set. It's going to work just fine, and then you can swap it out a little bit later. And then, you'll have a couple of extra pieces if you don't have a monster set yet. Anything you can for your head and shoulder. It doesn't really matter until you get your monster set. Monster set, you can do anything that you like. If there's some particular monster set you already have or other people have told you is good, for single target and for ease of getting, I recommend Celine's. That's an old world dungeon, very easy to clear, and you should be able to get the monster helm no problem. And it still does very good damage, albeit single target. But again, any monster set that you like would work just fine. As for our weapons, again, we have really choices of whatever you want to use. If you want to do a two-hander, you can absolutely do that. You probably want to use the two-handed spammable Wrecking Blow. If you do that for maximum damage, it's going to parse pretty much the same as everything else. Because it is a channeled thing, though, I kind of find Wrecking Blow a little bit hard to parse with, and so I'd only do it if you really enjoy it, and it will kind of mess up your timing a little bit on your parse, but you can get the same amount of damage once you get used to it. You could use an Inferno Staff if you wanted to go ranged and you wanted Magicka focused. You could go dual wield with daggers. So again, you can use really anything you wanted. If you wanted to, you could use a bow with this build. That would also work just fine if you wanted another stamina range option. So basically just whatever weapon you want. Just realize it might change your spamble. The Fighter's Guild and the Venom Skull you can use with any of those skills, and that's why I have them on here. But if you go with a weapon and you want to use their kind of spammable from that skill line, feel free to go ahead and do it. It's going to work just as well or pretty close to it. A lot of flexibility with this build. And that's one of the reasons that this build is so cool is there's a ton of flexibility with it. So you're going to be able to have your choice of like 4 or 5, probably more spambles, and they're all going to pretty much do the same damage. If you want to morph it to Magicka, or you want to go to stamina, you want to go to melee or ranged, making those changes is going to be very easy. And it's only going to require swapping out your weapon and a couple of skills. Now moving on, and I'm going to talk about traits in a second. Don't worry, I didn't forget. Now moving on to the rest of our gear. If you want the optimized set for dungeons and trials, you're going to go with Pillar of Nirn and Reliquin for single target damage, or if you want something a little bit easier to use, and if you're new, I would strongly recommend this. Instead of Reliquin, use Whirl of the Depths. Now, Whirl of the Depths is a light armor set, so just realize that will change up if you're going to go with that on your body instead of on your jewelry. That could change up. Those are the things that you want to take into account, whether or not you're getting a little bit more mag, or whether you're getting a little bit more stam recovery. And then, of course, there are other things that you get from wearing light or medium, but when you're new and you're beginning and you're not in an optimized group, it's not that big of a deal. If you're in overland, light is typically better. If you're in a group content, medium is typically better. And I know that there's some of you who are like, Nighthar, you're not covering all this stuff. It's supposed to be a simple build for, more beginner players, so I'm not going as in-depth in this video as I typically would. Now, if you wanted to wear Elemental Catalyst for the group buffs, you just typically wouldn't want. You could wear this in Overland just because Overland is so easy; it wouldn't be a big deal. But typically, you wouldn't want to do that for any kind of solo content. You just want to do it for group content, particularly trials. You would swap out Pillar of Nirn for Elemental Catalyst. And the reason you would do that is because the other two sets, World of Depths and Reliquin, are both trial sets, and their 3-piece bonus is just a 5% increased damage in dungeons and arenas, and that's significant. It's a big deal. So you wouldn't want to swap one of those out for one of these other sets, because Elemental Catalyst and Pillar of Nirn are both dungeon sets and don't have that 3-piece bonus, and so it will be a DPS loss, so something to keep in mind. But until you're getting to much harder content, it probably doesn't matter if you're wearing all light. Even in group content, it's just probably not going to be that big of a deal. And then for our monster helm, we've got Zaan. This drops some Scale Collar Peak. And I'm sorry, I should tell you where all these sets come from. I apologize. World of Depths drops from Dreadcell Reef. Currently the newest trial is the date of this video. And then Arms of Reliquin drops from Cloud Rest. You do not need the perfected versions of these guys. It does very little. We're talking like 1 or 2% damage increase. So I strongly recommend you to just farm it on normal, get the gear you need, and then eventually you can get it more into vet trials and get the perfected gear over time, but it's not that big a deal. For the other set, Pillar of Nirn, that drops from Falkreth Hold, which is a DLC dungeon, but a little bit older, and a lot of people are farming this right now, so it's not too hard to get. And then Elemental Catalyst, I think I mentioned, but it drops from Stone Garden. And then again, Zaan, this drops from Scale Collar Peak, which is a fairly challenging dungeon, especially on Veteran, which is what you'll have to do to get the monster set. I would note the monster sets only drop, the heads only drop on Veteran, and then the shoulder pieces you have to get from the Undaunted Enclave. Now let's go ahead and talk about gear traits. So this will be the same whether you're crafted or using dungeon or trial sets. So on your body, you want all divines on all 7 pieces. We want to go with max stamina. You could instead decide to stack max mag. That's totally fine. You would just enchant everything. Make sure you're running all max mag stuff. But for this build, for today, I'm saying, run all max stam. And then for our jewelry, we want bloodthirsty. If you are getting crafted jewelry from somebody, just use white. You don't need to upgrade it. It's extremely expensive to upgrade jewelry, and you're not going to lose that much damage. It's really not worth it. It's like a ton of gold cost for very little increase in damage, so I wouldn't worry about it. And then the enchants on that, we're going to go with weapon damage. And again, in update 37, that's going to give us a little bit more stam recovery, which is why this says multi-effect enchant here. Now, let's go ahead and talk about mythics for a second. So with this build, if you're going to run a mythic, what you would do is just drop your monster helm and then run Slimecraw, ideally the head. And that drops from Wayrest Sewers 1, a very easy dungeon to do on Veteran, all things considered. I'm not saying it's super easy, but all things considered, it's on the easier side. And you can just go farm that. It's really easy to get the head. You don't need to worry about getting the shoulder from the Undaunted Enclave in that situation. And then you would just move one of your 5-piece sets. You would just add a shoulder piece of that set. And then wherever the mythic went, that's what you would replace. So Ring of the Pale Order is a great mythic for solo content because it heals you based on the damage you do. So that's awesome. The more damage you put out, the more you heal. So that'll work really well with this build and might make it where you don't really need a heal, or where you can use the Spirit Mender morph that reduces your damage taken by 10% because you're already getting a ton of healing. That'll reduce your damage taken and give you a little bit of heal over time. So that's one option. If you wanted something like the Harpooner's Waiting Kilt, that'll also be just fine. So really any mythic, if you decide you want to wear it, you just drop your monster set, one of the pieces, and then you could also use any 1-piece crit set. Slimecrawl just does a little bit more 1-piece crit bonus than the other 1-piece crit sets. Now, let's go ahead and talk about race, Mundus, CP, and food, and all that good stuff. So for race, for this build, I always like Dark Elves because they work really well as stamina or Magicka builds, and I never know when I might want to remorph it. If you have a particular race that you really like to play, it's going to be at most like a 5% damage decrease. So instead of doing, 94K, you'll be looking at doing like 88K or something like that, or 89, I mean. So, not much of a difference in DPS, even in the worst case scenario. But any class, like Wood Elves are really good for stamina builds. Orcs can be as well. So just, look, if it says stamina and you want to build a stamina character, then that's probably going to work pretty well for you. If it has Magicka and you want to build a Magicka character, that's probably going to work pretty well for you, and it's not that big of a difference. But I would probably say Dark Elf or Wood Elf would be my 2 go-tos for this build. Now for Mundus, we're going with the Thief Mundus, as you probably already saw. The reason we're doing this is because it does the most damage. That's really all there is to it. It increases our critical strike chance, and that gives us the biggest buff to damage. For CP, we're going with on the blue tree, Biting Aura, Master at Arms, Backstabber, and Exploiter. I will note if you're doing solo content, you would probably want to swap Backstabber for Fighting Finesse. Fighting Finesse just works in general. Backstabber, you have to be behind your opponent, and when you're doing solo content, you won't be able to get behind your opponent. It does a little bit less critical damage, but it's the next best thing, so it works just fine. If for some reason you're in content and no one is doing off balance, you would want to drop Exploiter, but honestly, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Hopefully in most situations, Optimize, someone will be doing that for you. For red CP here, we have the only thing you absolutely need that I would recommend is Rejuvenation, just because extra recovery is always good. Even though I told you this build has a really great recovery, you can always use more, I guess, at least in solo content. In group content, probably you wouldn't even need that. The other things I recommend, Fortified, it will just increase our armor, which generally reduces our damage taken. Celerity lets you move 10% faster in combat. You'd be surprised how often that can actually be very helpful. And then Expert Evasion, this gives us a free roll dodge every, I think, 45 seconds. And that's just really nice to have so that you don't waste all your stam whenever you might need to roll dodge to keep yourself alive. Now, for food, you've got several choices for food. I'm just going to pop it up here while I kind of talk about them. So you can either go with just straight max stam food or max Magicka food if you want the most damage, because those foods that only give one resource increase your damage the most. Now, for most people, that's not that big a deal, and so you might want to go something with max mag and max health, or max stam and max health. So that way you get the health and then the resource pool that you're stacking. So that's a really good way to go if you're in group content that maybe is a little bit less organized than it should be and you need a little bit more health. Although typically Necros get a little bit extra health just from passives in our skill line. So typically we don't need all that, but that's an option. You could go with Witch Mother's Potent Brew, which gives you max Magicka, max Magicka, max health, and then magic recovery, or Dubious Cameron Throne, which does the same thing for stamina. So that's also an option. I would say typically with this build, one of those, 3 basic options. I know there's 2 each, depending on stam or mag, but basically 3 options is probably what I would go with. In solo content, you probably want to go something with a little bit of recovery and something with max health. So again, like the Witch Mother's Potent Brew or the Dubious Cameron Throne. Now, let's go ahead and talk about parsing here, because Necromancers parse a little bit different than their classes. I kind of mentioned some of this already, but let's go and talk about it a little bit more. So you'll start off here with Blast Bones. So if you're in group content and your tank is counting in, they say 3, 2, 1. When they say 3, you hit your Blast Bones because it'll take 3 seconds to go off. Actually 4 if you're far away from your opponent. So if you're in a situation where you've cast Blast Bones from range, you want to cast it every 4th skill, not every 3rd skill. And if that's constantly the case, then you'll just go into that rotation where you cast every 4th skill your Blast Bones. You will lose a little bit of damage. It's not horrible, but it is kind of confusing when you go from every 3rd to every 4th skill. But that's just parsing on a Necromancer. After that, it's just all about getting all of our dots up. So typically you want to start with something, either our Boneyard, or if you're in range, use your Barb Trap. After that, maybe cast the Spam Bowl once. By that point, your Blast Bones typically is hit, or you just use your Spam Bowl one more time, and then go ahead and cast Blast Bones again. And then we should be able to use our Tether at that point, because there'll be a corpse on the ground. After that, once we're in our rotation, we just want to make sure that we're always Blast Boning every 3rd skill. So Dot or Spammable, and then Blast Bones, and continually doing that. And whenever your ultimate is up, just go ahead and use it. But your ultimate is one of those 2 abilities. So you might use a Spamble, Ultimate, Blast Bones, and then Dot, Spamble, Blast Bones. However it works out, try to keep up your dots 100% of the time while making sure you use the Blast Bone every 3rd skill. Now, you do have a couple of abilities that consume corpses with our Boneyard and our Siphon, so there can be situations where you might not have a corpse for one of those abilities. In general, once you're into a fight for a second, you'll have more corpses than you need, as long as you're not running around or running away from an opponent. But it can be something to consider, because whenever you cast your Boneyard without a corpse, it does do 30% less damage than it otherwise might. So that is something to consider. But again, once you get in a rotation and you're casting the Blast Bones every 3 skills, you'll always have a corpse on the ground. Just make sure you drop your Boneyard on top of one of your corpses. And you can see like a little mark, or you can see the visual on the ground of where your corpse is, or just know that it's the base of the opponent. And that's really it as far as the rotation goes. And actually, I think that's it for the video. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. If you have questions about this video or others, just drop it in the comments below, or come join us in the That Wasn't the Boss Discord, which is a Trials Discord that I run, but we're happy to answer questions for any and everybody. We have people that are on console, even though we don't generally play on console, who come by, hang out, talk, answer questions, ask questions, whatever. We're just there to be a resource for you. But anyways, that's it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.